Thanks for coming. I'm on the startup team. I run editorial and content, and we're all about sort of telling stories about customers and startups in the ecosystem. Essentially, you folks out here in the audience. And I was a journalist for a long time. I've written about culture. I've worked in places with cultures that weren't exactly stellar, let's put it that way. So I'm really interested to hear you guys talk about it. I want to introduce our panelists, and I'll have you guys tell us about your illustrious pasts. But to my left is Erica Alioto, who is the head of People and Development at Opendoor. Prior to that, at Yelp. And next to her, Tariq Meyers, who's got one of the greatest names, or titles, I should say. Greatest names, too. Global head of Belonging, Inclusion, and Experience at Coinbase. So, Erica, give us your background.
Let's see. Okay, so after college, I went to law school. Thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and finished law school, got my dream job at the law firm, decided it wasn't my dream job after all, left that, had no idea what I was going to do, but loved this tiny little startup called Yelp that was getting started, approached them and asked them for a job, and they didn't need a lawyer at the time, they needed a salesperson. I said, great, I'll do sales. 11 years later, I ended up leading the sales team at Yelp. Just left about 2 years ago, joined Opendoor as the head of people there. And Opendoor, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is we enable people to move. So it's an alternative to the traditional residential real estate buying and selling process. So I've been there for 1.5 years now, and having a great time. I oversee HR, talent acquisition, learning and development, real estate and workplace, and I'm also an active angel investor advisor for a number of startups.
Great. I just have to ask, so I think you said that when you were at Yelp it was about 13 people, is that
when
right?
I started it was 13, yeah.
Yeah, and you at the end, you were running people and...
I know, I was running sales. So we had a 2,200 person sales team, at Yelp. So I was running that when I left.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tariq.
Sir. Well, first, go Dubs. Just to put it out there. Go
Just
Warriors,
to be
for
clear.
sure. Well, one, thanks for being here. Culture is always a funky thing to chat about, but it's really exciting to see more and more folks get really invested in the work. Tariq Meyers, Boston native, so I'm kind of a bandwagon Warriors fan in many ways. Came out here about 8 years or so ago and started in the nonprofit world. I was working for a small nonprofit org called the Green Lining Institute. Was doing economic equity work there, where I was essentially elevating the voices of about 150 community-based organizations to the federal regulatory level, trying to co-create policy solutions to reverse the harms of the financial crisis. Probably the work of my life and the work that I've enjoyed the most. And after doing that for a little while, I said, what's next? And so I also found a funky startup called Lyft that hadn't even launched 24 markets yet. And ended up meeting the co-founders and just fell in love with the work and fell in love with what they were trying to do. Someone who grew up in Boston and experienced transportation inequity firsthand, getting to school, getting to a job, getting to a grocery store. I was really excited about the power that this platform had to connect people around the world. Started in the government relations space, so basically doing the same thing I did at this nonprofit. I was elevating the voices of our drivers and our passengers, and folks were really excited about the Lyft platform to legislators and to other government agencies, and was telling the story of belonging in the front seat, right? Like, what does it mean for two people, strangers, to get in the car, even though you grew up and you weren't supposed to get in the car with strangers, to go from point A to point B? And then loved that story so much that I said, okay, we do this great in communities, let's do this at home. So left the government relations team, ended up starting our first belonging and diversity program at Lyft, did that work for a little while, and then wanted my next challenge, and now I'm at Coinbase. Joined Lyft at about 100 employees or so, left around 3,000, and so clearly I was a startup junkie and wanted more of that excitement, and so joined Coinbase at about 200, and we're well to the 800 mark now. So exciting stuff, and excited to chat with all of you about this work.
Coinbase, crypto company, little crypto company we've all heard about.
Anyone heard of Coinbase?
I have to ask, Tariq, did you get rid of the fist bump at Lyft, or were you trying to keep that going? You used to get in a Lyft ride and you fist bump
Absolutely.
and sit in the front seat and
I still sit in the
sing
front
songs.
seat. It creeps people out, but I don't mind. And I still give the fist bump. But by popular demand, we retired the fist bump. But we
okay.
still live it in spirit.
Fair enough. So we're here to talk about how to build a culture that thrives. And look, I've been in Silicon Valley for a long time as a journalist, and now working with AWS and was at a venture firm. From both the inside and the outside, the technology world has not done a great job. And that's not just my observation, but there's been plenty of people who've written about it and talked about it. And so we're at a point now for the last couple of years where people are really paying attention. We have you guys, I think, to thank for much of that, but there is a concerted effort to do a better job. So we want to talk about where we are in terms of doing a better job, but then for everybody here who's building a company, whether that's 2 people now or 10 people now or 50 people now, like how to do it right. And what's at stake if you do it wrong? Because we've seen the sort of counterexamples of what doesn't work. So I want to start, let's start with you, Erica. We're going to talk about great culture and what the elements are and how to measure for it, et cetera. But what is culture not? What goes masquerading as culture when really that's not the essence of what culture should be? Is it food?
Ping pong tables and kegs.
Right.
I mean, I think when a lot of times when people think about they have a great culture, it's the superficial stuff you see when you walk in, which is what does the food look like? What are people doing throughout the day? Those things might play into a culture, but culture is not those superficial things.
All right, no ping pong for you guys. That's just
I don't dislike ping pong.
Right.
Ping pong is fine if you're not using ping pong to mask the other problems you have.
Right. Or free food or whatever perks you
Exactly.
might have.
Yeah.
Tariq, let me ask you the opposite side of the question then. If great culture is not perks and ping pong and foosball tables, what are some elements of a great culture and how do I recognize it when I come into a place as a potential employee for some of you folks?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think culture, to your point, Erica, is not what we hang on the wall, right? Although some of those things make us feel good. I love a good beanbag, right? I love good open office space. But I really believe that culture is our beliefs, our shared beliefs and our behaviors, right? It's this contract that we have between our employees, whether you have 10 or 1,000, right? And the way we treat each other, the way we behave, the way we engage the work, right? The way we reach our mission, the way we actualize into the employees that we're meant to be, right? It's a relationship that I think is, something that's defined by all of you. So that's what the organization defines as culture and what the needs, wants, and desires are of employees. And I feel like the masterpiece of culture is that space right in the middle of that Venn diagram. And that's your cultural sweet spot. So sure, I think the ping pong tables and the beer and the free lunch, which is amazing, kind of hang on the periphery, but really it's about the behaviors, the beliefs, and the interactions that we share, not only with each other, but with the organization and the work every day.
Erica, I want you to add to that. I mean, from your episode, you're nodding, so do you agree? And what else should we be considering as we sort of dig into this?
It's what do you tolerate? How do people treat each other? What do you not tolerate? It's how do you feel when you walk in and interact with somebody you're working with? When you look at the leaders, what are the values they're exhibiting? It's all of those things that create culture.
So for everyone, I think I have a great idea. I have a friend from college maybe, or grad school, or whatever, my last job. We're great people, we're nice people. We start a company. How do I assess my own culture as to whether it's good or not? It might be good for me, but how do I start to sort of, okay, I'm gonna make a concerted effort to build a great culture. Let me just start with assessing my own, what I've done so far. How do I do that?
I would start with looking at who you've hired so far. So when you look at the founding team, I think that's the foundation for your culture, right? The culture will grow and evolve as you grow as a company, but when you have 4 or 5 people you're starting with, and you ask yourself, do these people have integrity? Do they care about each other? Are they out for themselves? Or are they putting the company first? Those are the questions you have to be asking to understand whether or not you have the right foundation to build a strong culture.
Now, I'm building something from day one, so let's say I'm building a service or a product. And Tariq, I'll ask you this, but both of you, am I building my culture from day one then too?
Absolutely, right? Like I think Erica hit the nail on the head. Your culture evolves with every new hire, right? So the first time you secure that co-founder, the first time you're building out that next member of that team, I think requires new working norms, right? So 2 people working in a room together in a space is going to be radically different than 5 people working together with 5 different personalities. So I think you can definitely start building your culture from day one. Part of that is everything as simple as working norms, right? What are we working towards? What are the shared behaviors that we have with each other? What does respect look like between these 2 folks? Are we aligned on the work-life balance? Are we aligned on, the products that we're building? Are we aligned on the direction of the company? Those are all the things that inform a company's culture. And I think, great examples of the end product of asking those questions are the famed Netflix culture deck, right? And you can actually follow the journey that Netflix probably took. And there's a great podcast on this called How to Fire, but it was definitely an evolution. It started with having meetings with 30 people in a parking lot, right? All team meetings, to then eventually talking about the importance of transparency in all hands meetings. That's the example of how culture evolves with every new hire.
And we're going to get to firing, I know, but I want to, if I'm 2 people or 3 people or 4 people in a room, culture sort of by osmosis, it seems. Like we sort of know how we treat each other, and we know how we work together. But do I need to start really codifying my beliefs, when there's 2 of us, when there's 4 of us? Like when do I really need to start writing it down, as it were, and testing it out among the small team that I have, which will become a bigger team?
Well, I think agreeing on what are the values that we want to promote as a company. What are we willing to tolerate? What do we want to promote? And what are we not willing to tolerate? And
right.
If you can agree on those things up front, obviously that's helpful for when you go hire the next round of people. You know what the values are you're looking for. And that's it's helpful to identify it and write it down. As you grow, that might change a little bit, right? What you need at 100 people might be a little bit different than what you needed at 5 people. Maybe you really value collaboration at the beginning, but once you find yourself much bigger, maybe collaboration isn't as important. And so you have to constantly reassess what those things are.
Right. This is a question from Slido, and I encourage you guys all to just start adding questions, and we'll ask them as we go. But when do you switch from hiring for culture fit versus culture add? And this gets to belonging and inclusion and diversity, but is it never too soon to start thinking about, like, okay, here's what I am and here's what we agree on, but maybe we're not agreeing on the right things. We should bring in some other people who have a different point of view. Tariq.
Yeah, the diversity struggle is always a struggle, right? And I always get questions from early founders who ask, when do I start building out a diverse team? And I really believe that you start on day one, right? And this goes back to a cultural value. If you really believe that you want to build a product that's going to serve the world, and you really believe that you want to create the best idea out there, and you really believe that you want a team that promotes balance and promotes inclusion, and you really value diversity as a value, then you start on day one. Right? You don't have to wait to day 50 to do that. But I've also heard, Emily Chang does a great job at talking about this in her book, Brotopia, but I've also heard that sometimes, just like technical debt, folks really want to accrue some diversity debt, right? And say, you know what, we're going to have to hire the folks that we know in our network, that's gone to the same school, that look like us, that have the same skill sets to get this product or this business over the line, and then we'll worry about diversity later.
Well, so let me ask you about that, because there is a tension, or there could be a tension,
Sure.
right? Like, I am just building something and struggling to make it to my next round of funding, all right? Or to my next product launch, or whatever it is. So how do you balance that tension, and how do you argue then for taking away your focus from the product or whatever it is, and building a diverse culture and a diverse company?
I really do think it's a tough tension, and I think it's a tough line to toe. But personally, my own personal value, and I think we've seen it pay off in a lot of organizations, that when you have that balance on the team, no matter how small it is, it gets you to a place where you're able to curate better ideas and you're able to have a better experience. But finding that talent is really difficult, right? Because there's a quote that Emily talks about where it's like, talent is equally distributed, but opportunity isn't.
Right.
So it may be really easy to find someone who has a set of skills that is close to your network. But I guarantee you can find someone equally as great, right, who has the same set of skills, but just has a different identity and comes from a different background. But it takes a lot of work. And I've seen early founders do the work. I mean, I've seen founders hammer campus opportunities to find graduate students where, like, I think one of the organizations is NSBE, right, the National Society of Black Engineers. And I've seen early founders say, I am so committed to finding a grad student right now who can come build this product with me, and I want to be super intentional about finding that talent that's different of mine. Now, that founder who happened to be at Stanford could easily have just said, I'm going to find someone in my class to start this gig with, but instead they were extraordinarily intentional, given the dialogue that we've heard in Silicon Valley lately around diversity and inclusion, to find someone who gave them that balance.
But you guys just told me that we want to agree on a set of values and a set of behaviors and what we are willing to tolerate. At the same time, I want to bring in people who maybe don't have those same values, don't have those same sets of beliefs, because that's going to make me better. So how do I reconcile those things? And frankly, what does diversity mean then?
Yeah, so I think we're mixing two different things, and I'll push you on that. That I don't like the term culture fit. I think culture fit oftentimes is interpreted as who is like me, right?
I would agree.
When I interview you, you give me the answer I would have given, and therefore this is a good fit. Or I've heard it interpreted as, who do I want to go have a beer with after work, right? And the reality is you're not building the strongest company you can by finding people you like to have beers with. You have friends, hopefully, for that outside of the work environment. That doesn't mean you can't hang out and have a beer together, but it does mean, if that person doesn't drink beer, if that person might have kids that they have to get home to after work, there are all these reasons that shouldn't be your assessment of what the culture fit is. Values, hopefully your values are general enough that they don't exclude anybody because of their background, their gender, et cetera. Values should be shared among large groups of people. You might value integrity. You might value collaboration. You might value, out-of-the-box thinking.
Right.
That's not something that requires you to hire a specific type of person that fits into, a particular color or gender or other group.
Right, I see. You say it's hard work, so how do you go about that hard work of building, what are some practical ways that people here can start? We've talked about values, and I understand that, how you need to sort of codify those and come to an agreement on these things that are generalized that we can all get behind. But then how do you do that hard work of building out a really diverse group? Because it is much easier to go with what you know or what is in your network.
Yeah. So it's actually, I think it's easier, to your point, it's easier when you start from the beginning. So if you're a founder and you're trying to get, whether it's co-founders or early employees, a lot of times you're reaching out to the people you know, people maybe that you went to school with, that you grew up with, because they trust you, they know you, they're willing to jump on board with you when nobody else believes in your crazy idea. And so it's natural that you're going to find people who may come from a similar socioeconomic background than you do, or same geographic area, whatever it is. But the problem is that just keeps multiplying. So when you hire people that look and think like you, they hire people that look and think like them from their networks as well. So in terms of the diversity debt or the cultural debt we're talking about, it's the longer you allow that to happen, the harder it gets. If you don't have people who are going to pull from different networks, you're just exacerbating the problem.
Is that how companies, and this is a question that somebody posed, and I won't pin it on a specific company, but is that how companies go down this path that it's hard to recover from, where they just keep going and keep going? Like, how do startups, whether they're large or small, screw up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, there's this lack of intentional focus, right? Like, diversity truly has to be a value that a company values in order to move this needle. And there has to be intention behind moving the needle. The challenge that I think folks have is, I've heard comments around, diversity is too political, right? Like, we just want the best person, which, I think solidifies the stereotype that somehow considering another person's background is lowering the talent bar.
Right.
I've heard comments that, yeah, well, we don't have the resources to sponsor X conference or Y conference, right? Or we're just looking for the best talent. I mean, every possible excuse you can make, I think I've heard in the Valley, but I think the important thing is you have to know why you're doing it. Right? If you're just doing diversity, you just want to build a diverse team just to build one, and you don't have a why, maybe it's good for your customer, right? Maybe you think it's good for the world. Maybe you think it helps produce better ideas or better products. Whatever the case may be, without that why, folks start spinning, right? They'll hire a diversity and inclusion person, they'll hire a diversity sourcer, they'll hire a diversity recruiter, they'll sponsor Pride, they'll do all these different activities, but the challenge is if they're not fundamentally challenging themselves, right, to the why they're doing it, then all of their efforts fall apart.
Well, and that becomes window dressing also, right?
Absolutely.
You're like, oh, look at our diverse programs. Aren't we doing a great job?
Absolutely.
How, to get to specifics then, like, is diversity a measure? Like, is there a quantitative kind of aspect to it? I mean, should there be, look, we're going to need to hire this many people of this, ilk and this many people of this ilk? I mean, how do you know that it's there? Like, how do you know that you've got the right recipe and that it is diverse?
Well, I think that goes back to the why, right? So I'll speak to my previous experience where there was a commitment from a leadership team to reflect the US population because that was the product that we were building it for. And then we had to take a really hard look at ourselves and say, well, how far away are we from actually doing that? And we were pretty far away, right? And so that's where goals come into place. But I want to make sure that I'm making the distinction between goals and quotas, right? It is okay to set a goal that you want to represent your user base. It is okay to set a goal that you want to represent a certain population. What's not okay is saying that, well, I'm going to do whatever it takes to hire X identity or Y identity,
right,
independent of their background, independent of their pedigree, independent of their skill set. That becomes a check the box moment. Goal setting is really difficult. I think it makes folks who are less risk averse, who are more risk averse, kind of shrill a little bit, right? Because they're like, oh, like I still want to hire the best person. I still want to make sure that we're giving everyone the same opportunity. But instead, I think if you set a goal for what you want to be and why you're doing this work, then you're able to close the gap. I think diversity means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I'm very intentional about defining diversity for the company. Diversity is not, folks who just look like me or folks who just look like Erica. Diversity is a lot of things. There's no such thing as a diverse candidate, right? Our goal is to build diverse teams. But there are some groups, and we have to be real with ourselves, especially in the Valley, who despite their growing market availability and their graduation rates, are still dramatically underrepresented in our organizations. And so when I think about building my teams and thinking about our work, I focus on the canaries in the coal mine, right? The folks who are least represented, despite their growing availability, and bringing those folks closer to the fold while also creating an equal and equitable experience for all the different diverse identities, caregivers, folks with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, and others. But if we're not able to have the conversation about why certain demographics have been historically left out, we're never going to move the needle and become representative of the folks that we want to.
Well, so let me push on that, and Erica, I'll ask you, are we having that conversation honestly in the Valley now among the startup ecosystem? Are we doing better? And if we are, what is your evidence for that? I mean, we see all these books from Emily and others how we're not really doing a very good job at all, even as technology's influence gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So therefore, in some ways, we should be doing a better job, but are we?
So I think we're doing a better job thinking about it, talking about it, hiring people to focus on it. But there was a study that just came out that said diversity and inclusion training works for people who already believe in it, but if you don't believe in it, then it's not doing anything for you. So I think the problem is we've got a segment of the people we're trying to train and teach to create an inclusive environment and to embrace diversity who have no intention of doing so, and I think that's where the real challenge comes in.
There's a question from the audience, but how many of you guys have remote teams? Okay, so we're all in the same room. There's 5 of us, there's 10 of us. It's easy, or easier, let's say, to build that sense of values, try and bring people together. How do we do it with remote teams? Is there such a thing as, well, there is remote culture, but can it be good?
So I used this example the other day, actually. My head of learning and development, she has 8 people spread across 5 different offices who have never all been in the same room together, and they have one of the strongest cultures of any team at our company. And the reason for that is because She is constantly working with them to encourage each other, celebrate the wins, help each other out, rally around a goal. Those are the things that create really great inclusive cultures. It's not just about being together in a room.
Well, and do you know how she does that? Is it, Slack? Is it
It's
some
all
other
of-
mechanism? Is it, hey, we're going to get together in, Estonia next month, or not?
They've
But never gotten
literally,
together.
they've never all been together in the same room. A number of them have never met each other personally, face to face. It's Slack, it's email, it's video conference. We have tools these days that allow us to feel really connected, even if we're not all physically present together.
And so what do you think it is that they share? Like, what is it that sort of core that they share that makes them a tighter team and a more kind of hardworking, both, for the company and for each other?
Yeah. They share a very, very strong desire to help train and support and teach our team members. They share a strong desire to encourage each other and make each other better. And they share a positive attitude where even when things are really, really tough, they overcome it together as a team.
Right. This is a question from the audience, and one I had too. We've spent a lot of time talking about diversity. Diversity does not equal great culture. It's part of it, but what else is involved? What else do I need to consider, whether it's compensation, development? You're part of the development team, both of you. What are the other elements that I need to consider as I'm building out my culture?
Yeah, so the way I define culture, and I've done this now for, I would say, 200 to 800 employees, right? So I think, take that with a grain of salt. But I would say, culture to me is defined in 4 pillars. The first is belonging, right? So that's inclusion, diversity meets purpose, what we're creating together, setting it in the right direction towards our mission. The second pillar for me is achievement, right? So whether we're 10 employees or 1,000 employees, how do we recognize each other in the big and small ways for the work that we're doing together? The third for me is purpose, right? Like, I don't know if y'all have worked at a company where you feel like you're doing work every day and it's just not clicking, right? Like, your heart's not in it, your soul's not in it. And for me, I'm the personality type that if my soul's not in it and my passion's not in it, I'm just not gonna do it, right? Send me home, work from home on Fridays. I'm just not gonna make it happen. So purpose and the connection to mission and vision is so radically important for our employees. And the last one is pride, right? Like, you think about the competitive, we've been talking about tech talent, we've been talking about non-technical talent, we've been talking about talent more broadly. The marketplace is extraordinarily competitive. Add diversity on top of that, where so many demographic groups can go anywhere they want to now more than ever. I call it talent power because organizations are talking about D&I so much. You gotta create some pride with your employees. And pride may mean a t-shirt. I got a great gift bag from thank you AWS, right? Pride may be an event, an offsite, having a coffee with your team, right? Creating working norms where, from a remote first perspective, we start meetings with our remote employees, or we create working norms where we don't have our backs to the camera, right? When we're engaging our employees, we're proud to work with each other because of the mutual respect that we have. So when I think about creating a culture, I think, again, belonging, purpose, achievement, pride. And it seems like we're getting this right 2 times over now, where there's just a special magic sauce that you create when you not only help people feel like they're belonging to something greater than themselves, giving them a connection to what you're actually working on, recognizing them for the little and small wins, and then making them proud as hell to be a part of your team.
Erica, same for you, yeah.
That's great. And I would also add on there psychological safety. When you walk in the door to the office every morning, do you feel like your team is there for you? Do you feel like your manager has your interests in mind? Are people there trying to backstab you? Are there politics happening? Are you constantly looking over your shoulder? Or are you looking around going, you know what, I've got these really tough challenges to solve, and I'm confident that I have the resources and the support I need to solve them. I think that is a key to a really strong culture.
So you used the word feel sort of multiple times in those comments. If I'm a founder, like many of these people here, I might not sort of get an honest answer all the time. So setting aside feelings, how do I measure for it? How do I know like that I'm doing all those things that you talk about? So when I walk into my workplace, I feel like somebody's got my back. I feel like I'm respected. I feel like I can talk to people. So what are some tools and or mechanisms and things that we can all do to reality check those things?
Yeah, a few things. One is, you'll see it in the risks people take, right? If you notice somebody starts taking risks and then as soon as they fail, somebody comes down upon them and they'll start taking fewer and fewer risks. So you'll notice it, and that might take time to see that, but you'll notice they start becoming much more risk averse over time, and that's part of that psychological safety not being there. You can, when you get bigger, you can take engagement surveys. Usually with engagement surveys, because they're anonymous, people do feel comfortable being a little more honest than they otherwise might.
Right.
And then, personally for me, I always ask in my one-on-ones, like, I want to know what your score is on a scale of 1 to 10. How are you feeling? What can I be doing better to support you? So just asking the question. And if you don't feel like you're getting an honest answer from them, digging deeper and just asking more probing questions until you feel like you're getting it.
Tariq, how do you manage for that? How do you sort of get the feedback that you need to help build a better culture and a better workplace?
What's the word? I mean, proximity, right? Like, I just worry so much that we have lost our capacity to be proximate to each other in our experiences, right? So D&I stuff aside, right? Like, I love my job, love job security, but let's just take all that out for a moment. There's a lot that we carry with us to our offices, right? To our working groups of this building every single day. And the challenge, like when I think about my grandmother's experience, who still works to this day, because she's this proud Cuban woman, still working, she's never been given the space at work to talk about how she's feeling, right? It's always like, let's get to work, right? Let's jump into the project that we're talking about, because we're so crazed, right, to win whatever we're trying to win. And I think sometimes what I've seen at founder-led companies is that as the company grows, the proximity to employees and their experiences becomes slim, right? It diminishes. And we sometimes get in this God pod of trying to create, and iterate, and measure, and break things quickly and do it all over again, that we forget that the people who are driving our product forward. So I could give you a survey, right? We can co-create some solution together. I'll give you a one-pager of working with Tariq, and these are my working norms and all of their jazz. But there's nothing more powerful, in my view. I think Brian Stevenson talks about this best, and just being proximate to one another, right? There's something powerful about a founder sitting with their team for lunch, right? Which may be, for some of our smaller companies right now, okay, it's possible, right? But when you breach that 100-person mark, it becomes more difficult. Attending a meeting, right, that you wouldn't normally attend. Attending a team meeting that you wouldn't normally attend. Checking in about family and learning about people's experiences. I just feel like there's so much that's happened in this world, and the Silicon Valley can tell you about it, whether it's an election, no matter what your political identity is, whether it's a pride celebration, whether it's what's happening in Charlottesville, no matter what your political ideology is, somebody that you're with is carrying something with them. And we have to be more proximate to people and connect with them in a way that's deep. And so that's what I love about my job. I love strategic things, but the most tactical shit I do every day is sitting down with someone and just asking them how they're doing, right? And creating those deeper connections that they'll go and then be a force multiplier and do that for you and do that for you over there.
So that seems like a very powerful and also doable thing, right? I show up to meetings, I show up to lunch, and I invite you out. Erica, are there other things that, if not easy, we can start doing right away, or should be doing right away?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's just in how we treat each other every day, right? What are we talking about when there are things, in our awareness about what's going on around us? So you touched on what everybody brings to work with them every day. There was recently an incident in Dallas. Somebody was killed, and it was a big news story. And it was a very public story, and it was clear that it would affect a number of people there. And so reaching out to people who are in the office asking, how are you doing? Are things okay? What can I do for you? Do you need resources? Just like being aware of what's going on around you, around your team, and making sure that they know that they can reach out if they need anything.
As a founder, I want to get to, we've seen cultures that have gone bad, but when culture shifts, if I haven't put those foundations in place and things are going in the wrong direction, can I bring it back? And are there examples of companies that have done that? And how do you do that? Can you fix a culture that has gone astray?
Well, there's this one company out there that had a really hard time in the last few years because I think they let their culture go astray. And I believe that you cannot change your culture, one, if you don't root cause what's making your culture toxic.
Right.
And 9 times out of 10, you can blame it on a process, but people create processes, right? And so it's really important that you root cause what is making your culture so toxic. And I think the challenge is sometimes we're so afraid of losing key talent. And I'll just call them out. We're so afraid of losing brilliant jerks that we're willing to sacrifice the company's reputation, right, to win.
But do you lose in the process of winning?
I don't know, right? Like, I think that we haven't seen, in my view, an example of a company that, at scale, right, that has truly been able, in this short period of time, we're gonna give them a few more years to get it together, right, fully change their culture, their company's culture around. But I will say that I've been inspired by some companies that previously had some more toxic cultures in their capacity to communicate to the public in the most humble way. We messed up.
Right.
And we're willing to put in the work. And it may not actualize over time, but we're willing to put in the work to turn it around. I see it with diversity conversations too. We took a hard look at ourselves, and though we didn't do a great job in the last 10 to 20 years, especially at some legacy organizations like banking and others, we're willing to put in the work now. But 2 things I have to say is, one, you got to write it down, right? Because it disappears in the ether. CEOs turn over all the time.
Right.
But the other piece is what gets measured gets done, right? And so if you really want to change a company's culture, the human experience is difficult to measure, but people's feedback, you can write that down and put that on paper.
This gets a little bit to the firing question. Firing and culture don't necessarily seem to go hand in hand, but Erica, they do, according to you.
Yes. Well, your culture is who you hire, who you promote, and who you fire. More than anything. That's what creates your culture.
Absolutely.
Right? If you are tolerating brilliant jerks, if you are tolerating, not just tolerating, if you are rewarding bad behavior, people learn that that's what gets rewarded, and they start doing that. So you have to be, and I've seen this many times where you have someone who comes in, they're a very high performer, they piss everybody off, and you might be measuring that one person's performance. You're not measuring the impact, the negative impact they have on the culture, and the impact they might be having on everybody else's performance around them. So it's really crucial that when you document what those values are, you actually stick to them when you're hiring, promoting, and firing.
What about this sort of, and again, I think the jury's out on whether some very successful companies can make this cultural shift even as they're continue to be successful. But what if I'm like, look, what if I'm a terrible person but highly successful, and I have this notion that, like, look, I'm just going to build this kind of Darth Vader, company, and we're going to crush it, and I don't care who gets in our way, and why bother? Like, is that, because there's plenty of examples of successful companies that must be terrible places to work. How do you answer to that?
But that's their culture, right? At least there's a shared understanding that this is the Death Star, right? At least we all know what we're walking on.
Right.
I think the challenge that companies have is that their brand promise and their brand experience don't match, right? So if I'm out here promising you're going to have a career-defining experience of a lifetime, and we're a family and a championship team, and we believe in collaboration and inclusion and diversity, and we're going to pay you at the 75th percentile, and what is an MRP, and all this other jazz, and what are levels, and create your own title. When you get there and you're like, wow, this is not what I signed up for, then that's inauthentic. But if you go to market and say, we will fire you if you don't meet your OKRs in a quarter, and we will promote you within 6 months 2 levels if you could do X, Y, and Z, no matter what you want your culture to be, so long as the brand promise and the brand experience match, I can respect you. It's not the company that I work
so
for.
you don't have to go work there, but if you're signed on board to the Death Star, like you say,
Absolutely.
hey.
March me on. Store troopers all day. Like, I'm so about it. Absolutely.
All right, I'll buy that. I like that. I mean, not that I want to work at a Darth Vader company, mind you, but I like that approach. What about subcultures? You know, we talk about sort of culture writ large. How do I account for age, other groups within my group? And do I need to make sure that everybody has their own kind of cultural fit within a subculture, or do I want to make sure that everybody kind of connects together at this level of culture that we've been describing?
I'm okay with sub-team cultures, right? I sat with the engineering team the other day, and I was like, wow, this is not, like, I'm gonna go over here. Like, y'all definitely doing your own thing. Like, keep doing it. I'm trying to have a conversation. And like, nah, bro, like, I'm trying to do some peer coding. I'll see you in a little bit. But I think that sub-team cultures are okay, and I think they happen, right? I worked at a company where we had domestic offices in every metropolitan city, right, practically in the US. And every one of those offices just had a different culture. But we shared a macro culture, right? So when I approach this work at Coinbase, we have global offices across the globe. I say, you know, we should think globally but be locally flexible, or think globally but build locally. And I want to create that pride in local offices, right? Like, I want to be able to go to Portland and say, oh, wow, Portland got something that San Francisco doesn't have, right? And San Francisco has something that New York doesn't have, and New York has something that Dublin doesn't have. And this local pride, but still putting the company first, is a really beautiful thing. And I'm sure you've seen that too.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think, so, you know, the sales team at Yelp operated very differently than every other team. You walk onto the floor, it's like blaring music and people, you know, running around, you know, having fun. And if you go to a different floor, it would be much more serious and quiet. And same thing with our offices, right? Every office had a little bit of a different feel. Now, people were still aligned by the core values. And so I think values and subcultures are different things. As long as everybody shares the same values, a subculture is fine. In fact, a subculture can oftentimes rally groups to achieve certain goals. So whether that's an office-to-office competition, or you know, something that another competition, engineering versus sales, that can be a lot of fun, and I think actually get people to feel a bigger part of their team as well.
Do you need to get those subcultures to be proximate? Do they need to really understand each other on kind of like a human level and be like, okay, we're all going to go out together now, or no? No,
I mean, I think it's healthy for people to get along, to the extent, you know, if you're going to be working together, you want to genuinely like the people you work with. You want to be able to go in and feel like if I need something from the product team, I can walk over to them and I know them well enough, or at least I know that they'll be receptive to me asking for something. But you don't have to go out and want to do the same things together necessarily. You can have very different ideas about how you want to spend your time outside of work and still get along very well in the workplace.
Absolutely. Yeah, plus one. I mean, absolutely. I think that, you know, I mean, Erica hit the nail on the head. Like, we don't have to all eat lunch together, and we don't have to go out for beers together, right? But this always, I mean, I know we've been like beating the values head over and over and over again, but it's really true. Like, values don't necessarily need to be things that they hang on the wall, right? And they don't have to be these long, eloquent, you know, 14-page decks that talk about what you are and who you stand for and how you stand for them. But values can be as simple as 3 things that we all mutually agree on, right? So again, to Erica's point that I think is actually like beautiful because of the 2 companies that she works for now, like, if collaboration is a value, then I should be able to walk over to our product team and be able to have a conversation, right?
So who constructs those values? Is it these people in this room? Like, you need to start thinking, okay, integrity, you know, taking risks, whatever it is, those are my values. But who constructs them, and then how do you know that they are agreed upon?
I think founders and CEOs have to drive whether you're creating a culture doc, whether you're creating your core values. I think whatever your leadership team looks like, you gotta write them down and you gotta create them. But if you want them to be adopted, right? I think depending on the type of company you want to build, Death Star versus the alliance, then I think that it's also important that the Rebel Alliance.
Thank you.
Then I think it's also clearly I want to be on the Death Star. I think that you have to socialize it with the community, right? And I think that if you want your employees to buy into them, it's not a mandate. Culture is not a mandate, right? Culture is a contract. And so if I'm going to sign this contract, best believe that I want to have my input into understanding what I'm buying into, right, and what I'm helping to shape. So founders, CEOs, leadership teams, write it down, right? Define what you believe you want your company to look like and be, but also give the teams that you're building this for an opportunity to respond to it. And then once you have that shared agreement, I think you'll find that everyone is going to put the company first.
Can I change my values, and do I have to, or am I likely to have to as I scale?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can you give me an example?
Your value, it should be a living, breathing document,
Right.
right? It should be something that you reassess over time. Because so the problem, and I agree that you have to write down your values. You have to align on them. You have to write them down. You have to use them in your hiring, promoting, firing decisions. The problem with that is that you also have to stick to them as a founder and as a leader. And so once you've documented what your values are, if you're not living by those values every day, then it doesn't mean anything. It's not really truly a value anymore.
It is just on the wall, right?
It is on the wall. And so, that might be for a number of reasons. That might be because we've outgrown that value. That used to be something that applied to us when we were 20 people, but now that we're 500, it just doesn't work anymore. And so now it's time for us to reassess our values.
So, and that's possible, and how do I do that, though? I mean...
Yeah, I mean, it starts with the CEO, starts with the leadership team, and also, looking around and going, okay, what are we now? How do we work? What do we value as a company? And it may be different than what you intentionally started out to do, but that's how the company's evolved, and you want that reflected in your values that are written down and hung on the wall.
Right. We've talked a lot about things that don't work. What about some things that worked incredibly well? Whether that's from your own experience or things that you have observed around you. What are some things that you see startups doing that are just phenomenal and that we can all steal? Let's be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so definitely have some PTSD from the whole changing a value thing. People are really sensitive when you change values. I'm gonna let you know now. It causes some ruckus in the community. So super PTSD twice. But what I will say is, startups who are clear again about that promise and that experience, I just see their employees coming to work extraordinarily happy, right? Companies that just lead with empathy. Even if you're not an empathetic person, you can still leave with a little bit of empathy.
Oh, wait, how do I do that? If I'm not an empathetic,
Get a coach. I love my coach. I mean, I'm probably deeply empathetic, but I've worked with some people who are like, we're going to get you a coach, sir, right? And we're going to help you just tactically practice what it means to ask someone what their day is like, to make belonging or a question around inclusion.
Is that where you learned our conversation earlier?
There you go.
You were just asking so many questions.
That's what I was just trying to figure it all out, right? I think it's just deeply knowing someone. I think I encourage all of our managers, tech or non-tech, in every single one-on-one, you spend the first 5 minutes of that meeting checking in on the person's experience. 9 times out of 10, the first answer you're gonna get is, oh yeah, everything's fine, right? Because getting close to your boss and sometimes getting close to colleagues can be a little uncomfortable, right? And we're just not used to doing it in the workplace. But some of the norms that we create that I really love companies doing that are just very simple actions is everyone is accountable for checking in with their direct reports, and how they're feeling in the workplace, every one-on-one. Every manager at the organization is required to do a quarterly development check-in where you're actually creating a individual development plan for your direct report or for your team, right? In terms of performance management, right? To get promoted in the organization, you have to do some type of culture building. Even some of the big four consulting firms have this, right? Like shout out to Bain, for making culture a part of their performance management work. So there's just a number of companies who look at the entire employee life cycle and have really created these touch points where it's not just about the work, right? But your job is to build inclusive teams, and your job is to facilitate belonging within the organization. And it seems kind of fluffy, right? But there are actually like real tactical things that you can do to move the needle. It feels unnatural for startups and for orgs that roll out that process originally, but then it just becomes the norm and becomes the behavior, right, that we all end up adopting. So now,
and as a norm, does it mean I'm more successful? I mean, I think at the end of the day, everybody wants to be a success. But do I get to hire better people? Do I get to, have more revenue for that matter, or better customers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't debate like whether or not diversity and inclusion is good for business anymore, because like there's just like a whole stack of research that we can just be like, here, go read this. There's your moment.
I don't mean that. I mean just like good culture, right?
I think so, right? But again, I think it all goes down to what you want your culture to be. Because if you don't want to build inclusive leaders, right, and you don't want your leaders to be collaborative and advance their talent throughout the organization that ultimately saves costs to the business instead of putting all this weight on recruiting and talent and so on and so forth, then that's cool, right? And that's their prerogative. And I think to your point, we have seen financially successful companies who are known, right? I mean, Warren Buffett calls them out all the time for their tremendously poor cultures, but they're still successful. So it's all about what you want to build and how you want to build it. And some folks, management and inclusive management is just not an important value to them, so they don't adopt those type of practices. But I can say that I've worked for two dynamic companies who are incredibly different in their personality, right? But who have a shared commitment that they want to hire the best talent, no matter what backgrounds they come from, that they had a lot of work to do from a diversity and inclusion standpoint. They want to create the best leaders that have ever traversed this world, right? And they want to change the world. And I feel like to do that, you have to have a healthy culture that produces the best talent and that retains it over time with some of those practices I mentioned.
Eric, I want to pin you down on what you've seen that really does work, and startups that are doing the right things and what they actually are.
So I think it's great to have values. It's great to value diversity and inclusion. I think making sure it shows up in everything you do, starting with the onboarding process or even the interview process, is very important. So in interviewing, for example, you can, we have, it's Pride Month right now, we have on our screens, we have, stories about various people from the LGBT community and what they've done, and so it's an educational experience. When people come into the office for an interview, they get a sense that we value inclusion and diversity. Slack does, I think it's Slack, during their onboarding does a scavenger hunt that includes things like find the all-gender bathrooms, right? There are ways to infuse it into your everyday, starting from the very first time somebody steps into the office, to give them a sense that this is something we value. And if you don't value that, if you don't want to be at a company that values that, maybe this isn't the right place for you. And then of course, at every all hands meeting, anytime an email is sent out talking about a promotion, why somebody was promoted, just going back to those values, going back to how they fit into the culture, how they have lived the values, that just reinforces it on a daily basis.
Can employees instill values as well? And like, how much do you need to sort of pull from your employee base, and how much, again, is it driven from the top?
Oh, well, I would say, I've gone, again, like a lot of trauma in this process, but I would say, I've seen both of my executive teams that I work for now in this type of work, be very intentional about creating it seemed like a 20-page manifesto on like what our culture was and then adding all these funky values. And I've seen a willingness to actually hear feedback that changed the direction of that entire doc or that entire process, right? And so it really all depends on how much you value your employees' voices and how much you value their opinions, right? And how much of a collaborative process you want to engage in. When we were sourcing for some consultants to help us out, that was very real feedback from us. For us, some folks felt as though, you could do this on your own and you can just make these top down, and there will be people who may not agree and you may lose that talent. And are you willing to lose the talent because you've created these values and you didn't make it a collaborative process and that talent leaves? On the flip side, are you willing to make it a total open source moment where everybody and their mother has an opinion, right? And then it degrades actually the integrity of the original document and what folks were looking for. So I think there's like a really tough line that you have to walk with really understanding the type of company that you want to build that will ultimately help you reach your mission, right? But giving employees an opportunity to hear their feedback. I get feedback all the time about my job. I don't always take everybody's feedback, right? But feedback's a gift. So I would just say that, you don't have to incorporate every single note that someone has about a value or a culture doc, whatever the case may be. But I think there has to be a willingness to listen, right? And I think it's up to you as whomever is creating that doc, whether you create a committee of execs and employees, whether it's just execs who have the final word, whatever the case may be, it just really depends on what your value is for your employees' voices.
This was the question that I wanted to ask. Like, when do I hire people like you? Do I have to do that from you're the third hire, you're the fourth hire, you're the 10th hire? When do I bring in people like you whose job it is to do this?
I don't think there's a specific point at which you have to bring somebody in to focus on it. From a very early stage, I would say if you hire people who are passionate about it, then it can be very bottoms up. And what you'll notice is there will be people who will be driving the conversation, who will be pushing you. Hey, why aren't we more diverse? Why, can we focus more on it? We should be doing something to celebrate Pride. We should be doing something, and they'll push in the right ways to make sure that those things are paid attention to. We still don't have, we have somebody who's now finally at 1,400 people is a program manager who part of her directive is to focus on diversity and inclusion, but until now it was very much bottoms up. I talk a lot about it and what it means to create an inclusive environment. I share stories regularly about how we can be more inclusive, and we do manager training, making sure people understand what things actually happen in the workplace that make people feel like they don't have a sense of belonging. So those are things you can infuse without having somebody specifically dedicated to the role.
Well, I love my job. I really do. But I'm trying to get myself out of a job, right? That's my goal. And I feel like when, my job is not to just be the one diversity, culture, belonging practitioner in an office, right? My job is to enable, right, and to act as a force multiplier in the organization to upskill and help folks understand some folks who have never engaged this work before, right, who have never talked about privilege and power and diversity and inclusion and why we have to take a special lens in performance management to make sure that folks are equitably advancing through the organization and so on and so forth. These are all these things that I don't own by myself. So my hands are literally in everything, right? No day has ever looked the same for me throughout the entire time I was doing this. And that's when I know it's time for me to leave, right? I know, we were talking about why did I leave Lyft? And I think it's because I felt like the work that I committed to doing got done, right? And then it was time to move on to build it again. But I don't think I should be the only D&I practitioner. Love my job again. But I think it's about bringing others along for the journey. Now, on the flip side, I know there's a lot of opinions out there about whether or not you need to hire someone in my capacity. But I think Erica can speak to this too. It takes a lot of emotional labor to do this work. And I have to be honest, disproportionately, the folks who have roles like mine look like me, right? Let's have an honest conversation, right? And so what ends up happening is that the folks who don't get paid to do this job and still are passionate about the work also look like us, right? And so my whole thing is, if you're gonna do the work, right, reward someone for doing the emotional labor of the organization to bring it along. But what I end up seeing is all this D&I fatigue that a lot of employees have, whose job is not officially theirs, doing the work and not being rewarded for it, or not being recognized for it, or burning out, right? Or not having the clout, or the seat at the table, or the resources from the grassroots perspective to move some of the work over the line. And I think we see it in the higher education space too, with Black and brown professors and professors with disabilities and professors from the LGBTQ community and so on and so forth. So my whole thing is, have someone who has a seat at the table. And obviously, like my esteemed panelist here is leading an entire team, so she definitely has a seat at the table. But so many other folks who are moving from the grassroots efforts don't have that seat, and so they just burn out, right? Or they end up leaving the company.
All right, I want to go to more Slido questions. We've gotten through a lot of these, but this one was voted up the most. So clearly you guys are thinking about flex time. Is flex time away just a trap to never take holiday? How do you deal with making sure employees take breaks? Now, this is from the Netflix culture deck, at least the first time I saw it. We're like, oh yeah, take as much vacation as you want. Just make sure you get your work done.
So we have flex time, and people take their flex time. People work very hard. On average, people take minimum 3 to 4 weeks a year. Some people take more than that. We try to ensure people are taking vacations on a regular basis. I think, especially when you're working at a startup, you need to recharge. We're doing hard work, we're grinding all day long, and if you're not recharging, you're probably not getting the best out of your people.
So how do you make them take vacation or enforce that?
I'll tell people to take a day or a couple days off. I'll tell people to take 2 weeks off if I notice they haven't taken a long vacation in a while.
Right.
I'll look at, we use Workday for PTO tracking, and if somebody hasn't taken any vacation this year, then I'll just nudge them, or
Right.
I'll force them to put it on their calendar.
What are some valuable, I think we covered most of this, some valuable culture initiatives that are easy to implement? I think we covered some of those. What are the most difficult things that you're going to start to tackle?
I think the hiring piece is really tough. Like, I don't want to make culture all about hiring, because it's not. But I think some of the hardest work is if your culture evolves with every new hire, right? Like, how do you get crystal clear on what does it mean to be a part of this company, right? I think what ends up happening is that we focus so much on pedigree, right? Like, where did this person come from? Like, where did they work? What school did they go to? But we don't focus a lot on the skills, right? And some of the values that we want these folks to have. As I said before, an environment that's grounded in belonging takes time to evolve, and it's something that you have to constantly curate and protect time over time, every time you add a new hire. But you're set up that much more for success, right? When you can be crystal clear about who you're letting into the door. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about culture fit, right? But is this person going to be a good addition to the community that we're building? And does this person have the skills, right? Like, whatever about pedigree, forget about a degree requirement, right? Like, are we crystal clear on what is it going to take for this person to be successful? What it takes for this person to be successful then sets them up for success to advance through the organization. We're clear on why we hired them. We're clear on why we're advancing them, right? But then in some cases, we have to be, to Erica's point, very clear about why we're firing them too. I really believe, and I've seen it, like, that is the hardest part, and probably the second one, which we were chatting about, is the performance management piece, right? So how do you really grow and develop your talent over time? Do you believe in this room that the organization outgrows talent, or do you believe that it's important for you as an organization to help upskill your talent, right? Real questions.
Just to be clear, you guys, do you believe in culture fit at all, or is that sort of a red herring?
I just think you have to be very careful about how you use that term. It's easy to hire people that think like you, that come from the same background as you, that talk like you, and I think that's what culture fit,
Right.
refers to.
But it doesn't get you much. I mean, it sounds like I'm hearing you both say that, or I've heard you both
and
say that.
I think the question is, how are you, to get to, like, what are some of the harder things we have to do? To what extent are we willing to change our environment to adapt to people's needs, to give them a sense of belonging? And so, we had an engineer, when I was at Yelp, there was an engineer who was deaf. And so, some people might say, well, how does that work? Well, how are we going to communicate? We had somebody set up, somebody could come in and teach sign language to the team so they could communicate. So it's not just about making people meet you where you are. It's what are we as a company or as a team, what are we going to do to adapt to meet people where they are?
Right.
And I think that's where belonging happens.
This is a Death Star question. My whole sub-teams knew that we were on the Death Star in our org, and no one listened or asked about us because we were the worker bees with 10 to 15 years of experience. How do you approach sub-teams as a leader, founder to address any misalignment, but also respect that they are doing great work? So if I'm on the Death Star and I'm just one of the worker soldiers or stormtroopers, how do you acknowledge them, and how do you respect that they're doing great work?
Well, I'm big on recognition, right? Like, I think recognition is incredibly important. But I'll be honest, I've seen some environments where the same people get recognized for the same work time and time again, and it just so happens that they come from the same demographic group, so that's really disheartening. I see it as my job, and I think we've done this in simple ways. So how many folks use Slack in this room right now? You on Slack? I love Slack. I wasn't really great at Slack, but my Slack emoji game is really strong right now. But I'll say that, like, we created a channel that was very simple. It was called Yay. And this was at Coinbase when we were a lot smaller, and it was an opportunity for those worker bees to recognize each other, right? So, like, shout out to so and so for doing some amazing work, and shout out to so and so for doing this simple action, and shout out to so and so for helping me out on this project. And sure, some of the other, darker leaders, right, like Kylo Ren and others, they may not give that recognition, but it ended up changing some of the behavior, right? And I've noticed this, where now when, we have an enterprise level values award process. So, at the end of the quarter, folks are called up for recognition. And some of those folks who were in that Yay channel, right, a simple Slack that takes 2 seconds, started being nominated for those enterprise level awards. And we added some other rigor to the process, but we started seeing that there was more diverse voices who didn't always get the recognition, who were the worker bees in the back, who didn't really necessarily know, whose work wouldn't necessarily be elevated, get elevated. Right? And then the company started valuing equally the director of engineering as the support analyst that sits in Portland, right? Because the work at the end of the day is helping to support our mission and our vision. So that's just like a real tactical way of creating a space or some recognition program that doesn't cost a damn thing, right? To be able to move the needle and help some of the folks who get lost in the shadows have a shout out because their work matters.
Well, we're out of time, and I know you guys want to get together and communicate, or network, I should say, and get proximate, and maybe check the Warrior score. So I want to thank you guys. I love this idea of proximity, of a contract, of measuring things, of writing things down, of making sure, the values that you set match the people that you bring in. But it sounds like it's never over. You're always got to put the work in. So, Erica, Alioto, Tariq Meyers, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.